Hi, this is Dr. Dickinson, and in this recording, I'm going to be explaining how you can use the learning map to design instruction. So stage one is planning your instruction. We have our 6 elements that will be incorporated throughout the learning map, which are teacher, learner, target, assessment, instruction, and management. So in your first part of this lesson, you'll be looking at the target, your standards, your social emotional skills. I selected the standard for 3rd grade math, which is operations and algebraic thinking. The standard is to interpret products of whole numbers. And what I did here is I highlighted the main idea, the knowledge that I want my students to know, which is products of whole numbers. Then I underline the skills and the verbs. And it's the how. So they'll need to be able to interpret, which means they've demonstrated understanding and they can explain what a product is. So based on the standard, I will then identify some big questions, some knowledge and skills that I want my students to be able to demonstrate throughout this unit. So some big questions that are related to this standard is, what does each factor represent in a multiplication problem? How can you determine the product of 2 multiplication factors? Now, based on these 2 big questions, I can think about the types of knowledge and skills that my students will need in order to answer these questions. So for knowledge, they'll need to understand multiplication of whole numbers in situations. They'll also need to know what one factor represents, the number of groups, and the other factor, the number of items in each group, whereas the product represents the total number of items. They'll need to understand and use vocabulary such as factor, product, symbols like X, and means groups of. What does that mean? The skills that I will explicitly teach is what is a factor, how to find the total number, how to read, for example, 3 times 5 as 3 groups of 5, how to model multiplication situations using concrete materials and connect representations to numerical expressions. They'll also need to know how to write and read equations, for their models and drawings. So based on these knowledge, skills, and big ideas, I can then kind of synthesize this information into a student learning goal. This might be something that I share with my students. So students will be able to model multiplication situations using appropriate vocabulary to explain pictorial representations, drawings, and symbolic representations, to determine what each factor represents and the product of 2 factors. So no longer am I just determining if my students know what 3 times 5 is, but they need to understand conceptually what 3 groups of 5 is and what each factor within that problem represents. I've also identified a social emotional goal for my students. Now they are 3rd graders, so they'll be able to demonstrate appropriate social skills when working in small groups to build a common understanding of multiplication situations using concrete materials. Next, I'm going to think about some barriers to learning for my particular group of students that I'm working with and in relation to the content that I'm teaching. So in my particular class here, I have a large percentage of English language learners, so students might have difficulty with vocabulary words with multiple meanings. Terminology will need to be explicitly taught with visual cues for prompts and closed sentences to support use of terminology. Common misconceptions are subject-related issues that I might come across when teaching this lesson. I'll also want to address some knowledge gaps. So oftentimes students come into the classroom and they might not have the prior knowledge needed to work at their grade level. Any other concepts that might be confusing, multiple meanings, cultural differences, etc. So in previous work, students learned that both addends represent the total number of items that are joined for the sum. This, however, is not true for multiplication. Therefore, students in this class may overgeneralize, which may lead to misunderstanding. Then I'll talk about my classroom composites. So this is the whole group. This is a particular group of students that I'm working with. It might be a class period. It might, if I'm in a self-contained class, it would be, the class that I'm working with. I'll talk about some patterns, emotional regulation, language and literacy subgroups, etc. This particular group, there is a pretty diverse background. There's proficient use of technology. A third of the class are English language learners, and then I talk about their attitudes and social and emotional skills. Then you want to talk about some accommodations, adaptations, interventions that you will need for 2 of your students in your class. So focus student number 1 should be a student that has special needs. This might be an IP 504, so you want to look at their IP goals. I give an example of a student who has ADHD, is easily distracted, poor writing skills, and some things that I might do to support them. Same for your English language learner. It should be somebody that has identified as a second language learner, and some of the appropriate accommodations that I'll use in this lesson. Now on to my instruction, right? And I will be using the UDL model, which is multiple means of representation, engagement, action, and expression. Now remember, in the UDL model, all of these 3 broad areas are happening simultaneously. So you don't need to write a separate lesson or a separate activity for each of these areas. They're gonna be happening simultaneously. So when I'm thinking about how I'm going to represent the concepts of multiplication, I'm also going to be thinking about that in the context of, different ways for my students to express what they know, as well as engaging my students. So in this particular lesson, I've identified a few activities that will help build their conceptual understanding, and that includes, because it is math, working with manipulatives, giving them problem situations, playing a fun game that would help them hone in on the idea that factors, what a factor is. And then students will be creating a problem. This could be more of my formative assessment here to see what they understand at this point. And in the problem that they create, they'll need to use 2 factors to demonstrate their understanding. They'll need to write a sentence or 2 to explain the problem situation, and they'll need to give a pictorial representation of the situation. So in terms of engaging my learners, when I talk about all of these different activities that I'm going to be doing, I'm engaging them because I'm beginning with real life situations and having them use concrete materials to represent these situations. And I give a particular example of having markers in my classroom, and each package contains 5 markers. If I have 3 marker packages, how many markers do I have altogether? So students might actually get a chance to illustrate that or use manipulatives to represent these problem situations. So it's real life, it's hands-on. They're going to play a game working with a partner. And this is going to give them an opportunity to draw some illustrations here. So it's another way to engage them, working with a partner. And working and by creating a word problem, they'll have some choice and some creativity as well. And how does this really tie into multiple means of expression? Okay, and this is the practice and assessment piece. Well, they're going to work initially in small groups to help build these representations. So they'll have a lot of peer work going on and abilities to talk to their peers and share ideas. And then when they're playing their game, they're going to work with just one other peer, and they'll be able to develop some fluency. So this might be a way to kind of do some more homogeneous grouping. If I have students that are moving along a little bit faster, they can be challenged with another high peer, and give me an opportunity to kind of reteach and support the students that need some reviews here. They'll be given some choice and creativity to develop their word problem. Again, the notion of giving a representation in a real life situation that's meaningful to the student, and being able to share what they've done with their classmates. There will be a rubric, which will be how I will assess them, and this rubric will be shared with them so that they have an understanding of what they need to do. In terms of managing the classroom, I'm going to talk here about my classroom management system, and this is a rewards-based system so that students are going to get points for on-task behavior and completing the activity. This system will help promote group work and self-management, making sure that when I am planning out these activities that obviously require a lot of materials, they'll be organized in bins for easy access and distribution. They'll also have a rubric that they can use to kind of self-assess and go through the formative assessment of writing their own word problem. All right, so now that I've thought about all these great activities that I want to do that help me teach my standard and assess my students' learning, stage 2 is the teaching stage. So this is going to be my 3x5 card, my quick sheet or agenda that I'm going to write on my board. It's going to help me prompt me as a teacher in terms of what I need to do when I get in the classroom. So I'm going to just start with that first activity that I described, which is students are going to have a variety of multiplication situations with visual cues, so pictures to prompt and support their learning. I'm going to post these situations on a web-based game called Kahoot so that the students can solve the problem and enter their responses on the computer system. So what materials will they need? Well, each group will have a computer so they can respond to the prompt. They will get some counters so that they can use the counters to represent the number of items when they're given the problem situation, and they'll have cups so they can place the counters in a cup to represent the number of groups. Again, I'm going to be assessing them using the Kahoot app, and that's going to give me real-time data so I can go back, I can look, we can have discussions as soon as the students enter their response. After I've done the teaching stage, then I can move into stage 3, which is looking at all of that evidence that I just collected, thinking about some instructional decisions I will make. Finally, after I've done some assessment of my data, I can move on to stage 4, which is reflecting about my teaching and learning experience. Now that I've done this game, I've created these situations, how will this help me with future instruction? What new information did I get about my students in relation to their learning preferences? What was effective in this lesson? What might I change? And what have I learned about myself as a teacher? So all really good questions that's going to help prompt and fuel me and help me think about how I can improve in my practice. All right, well, I look forward to seeing your learning maps, and I hope this video was helpful in terms of unpacking the learning map.